History rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes, all it takes is a small shift in decision-making, and the world that emerges a decade later looks nothing like the one we expected. It's 1989. The Cold War is ending, the Soviet Union is falling apart, and the United States is preparing to enjoy its long-promised unipolar moment. But in Beijing, things are far from settled. Thousands of students have filled Tiananmen Square calling for reform. It's a moment of pressure, uncertainty, invisibility. The entire world is watching. In our timeline, the protests ended in tragedy. What followed was a decade of caution. Sanctions from the West, frozen diplomatic ties, and a China that remained economically ambitious but politically sidelined. But now imagine the protests ended differently. Let's say the Chinese leadership, calculating, cautious, and keen to avoid the Soviet Union's fate, decides not to send in the military. Instead, they allow student leaders to meet with party officials. They acknowledge demands for reform, promise transparency, and position themselves as a government open to change. The response is still tightly controlled. Money's money, but it's nonviolent, and that makes all the difference. The images on TV are no longer tanks and bloodshed. They are dialogue, flags being lowered, students exiting the square. Western newspapers don't scream massacre. They write, "Beijing shows restraint, a new chapter." That one divergence changes China's global image. It no longer looks like a regime cracking under pressure. It looks like a state adapting to the modern world. And to global markets, that means one thing: opportunity. By the early 1990s, investment starts flowing into China faster than ever. But unlike in our world, where most foreign companies use China for low-cost manufacturing, this time they treat it as a partner, not just a workshop. German and Japanese firms established joint ventures in electronics and automotive sectors by 1993. American tech companies, eager to expand beyond saturated domestic markets, begin building out research facilities in Shanghai and Guangzhou. China's special economic zones, launched in the 1980s, receive an upgrade. Not just export hubs, but innovation districts with tax breaks for design, logistics, and software firms. A critical shift begins here. China skips the long phase of being purely a low-cost manufacturer and begins integrating into global supply chains as a systems player. And this has real consequences. Let's take the example of telecommunications. In our world, Huawei begins its rise in the late 90s, initially supplying cheap routers and switches for domestic networks. But in this alternate timeline, with earlier access to foreign capital, talent, and regulatory support, Huawei begins expanding abroad by the mid-90s. It doesn't just build hardware, it starts licensing software, offering network design services, and forming partnerships with developing countries hungry for telecom infrastructure. By 1998, instead of relying on Western suppliers like Nordel or Ericsson, emerging markets from Southeast Asia to parts of Africa are buying Chinese-built, Chinese-coded systems. Not out of ideology, but because they're available, cheaper, and increasingly reliable. This leads to something subtle but powerful: technical alignment. Nations start to use Chinese standards for mobile frequencies, for encryption protocols, for device certifications, and as more countries adopt these, China gains a kind of soft leverage. The more the world depends on your systems, the more relevant your regulations, your engineers, your language become. In the US, most people wouldn't notice this shift at first. But by the late 1990s, American telecom providers might begin offering services partially built on foreign standards, and software updates arriving from Chinese servers would slowly become normal. By the late 90s, the effects start compounding. Chinese banks, learning from Western models earlier, begin launching international-facing branches. The yuan isn't yet a reserve currency, but it's present in trade settlements in South Asia and the Middle East. At this point, no one's talking about the end of dollar dominance. But for the first time, there's an alternative visible on the horizon. Meanwhile, inside China, the earlier influx of capital and expertise is transforming education. Universities in Beijing and Shanghai begin offering globally competitive programs. Foreign faculty are hired. Exchange partnerships with American and European schools are signed 5 years earlier than in our timeline. A class of globally literate engineers, financiers, and technologists is being trained, and they graduate into a booming domestic economy that doesn't rely on outsourcing contracts, but creates its own intellectual property. For US students, this could mean a new kind of competition. Not from abroad, but from global firms now hiring graduates from both Stanford and Tsinghua in equal numbers. By the end of the decade, this version of China is still authoritarian, but it's seen as competent, stable, and increasingly indispensable. As the 2000s begin, China finds itself not just richer, but more connected, and not only to global trade routes, but to the architecture of the emerging digital world. In this timeline, Chinese engineers are laying down fiber optic networks not just in rural Sichuan, but in Kenya, Iran, and Kazakhstan. These aren't just business decisions. They're shaping how the internet itself spreads, what platforms it favors, what standards are enforced, what languages become default. China's digital ecosystem, emerging earlier and with more state backing, begins to offer services the rest of the world starts to use. Not because they're forced to, but because they're faster, cheaper, and increasingly interoperable. Governments in Latin America and Southeast Asia sign agreements to adopt Chinese-made e-government platforms. Schools in Nigeria and Malaysia begin using educational tablets developed in Shenzhen. Mobile payment systems modeled on early versions of Alipay appear in Turkish markets by 2006, not just as pilot programs, but as national solutions. In the US, some of these systems reach consumers indirectly. A startup in Austin uses Chinese-built logistics APIs to power cross-border delivery. A high school in California integrates Mandarin into its business and tech curriculum, not for prestige, but because the job market demands it. As these technologies spread, so do the assumptions built into them. Chinese language support becomes more common in global interfaces. Developers around the world start learning to write plugins and tools compatible with Chinese software frameworks. It's not that English disappears, it doesn't, but for the first time it shares space with another linguistic system that isn't a translation layer, but a source. And in boardrooms from Jakarta to Nairobi, and increasingly New York, business decisions start to reflect that shift. But perhaps the most far-reaching changes come not from technology or trade alone, but from the way money itself moves. In our world, the US dollar dominates global finance. It's the default currency for everything from oil to aircraft parts. But in this timeline, China's earlier integration into world markets, combined with its aggressive infrastructure diplomacy, gradually introduces the yuan into places it previously never reached. By the early 2000s, several African central banks begin holding a modest portion of their reserves in Chinese currency. Energy exporters in Central Asia begin accepting partial yuan payments for gas deliveries to Chinese provinces. The reasons aren't ideological, they're logistical. Chinese-funded projects are often structured in yuan, and it's simply easier to recycle that capital within the same financial ecosystem. That shift is slow, but it's also sticky. As trade flows and loan structures become more yuan-denominated, local financial systems adjust. Chinese banks open regional branches. Local bond markets begin listing debt in yuan alongside dollars and euros. And most importantly, the informational infrastructure of finance, payment networks, settlement protocols, accounting software begins to accommodate multiple standards. It becomes possible to move seamlessly between currencies in a way that subtly weakens the dollar's psychological hold on international finance. American consumers might not notice at first, until a Chinese-backed fintech app becomes the default for international payments, or until a student loan provider begins offering rates tied to yuan-denominated global indexes. Again, the dollar doesn't vanish, but in this world, it competes. As the 2000s teens approach, something else is shifting. Not in spreadsheets or undersea cables, but in cinema, classrooms, and television screens. Cultural power, long dominated by the West, begins to pluralize. In this version of history, China's earlier rise gives its creative industries more time, funding, and international access to expand. Mandarin language films, once confined to art house festivals, now screen widely in commercial theaters in Europe and South America. Streaming platforms with Chinese backers begin to license domestic dramas and game shows, offering dubs in Spanish, Turkish, and Swahili. Western studios still lead the global box office, but they now have competitors who play by different storytelling rules. In the US, a generation grows up on global content where Chinese franchises share the spotlight with Marvel. Language exposure comes not through textbooks, but through subtitles. Video game worlds are increasingly designed in Chengdu or Nanjing, and on TikTok-like platforms, the back-end moderation protocols are written in Hangzhou, with little American input. Meanwhile, Chinese universities, flush with global students, many on government-backed scholarships, become hubs of not just science and engineering, but of media, literature, and policy education. Students return to their home countries with not only technical expertise, but a cultural vocabulary shaped partly in Beijing. By the early 2000s and 20s, you can see the impact in subtle ways. A Mexican entrepreneur launches a startup using cloud infrastructure built in Chongqing. A Senegalese filmmaker wins an award at a Chinese-sponsored film festival and gets distribution in East Asia. A Polish think tank publishes its white paper in Mandarin and English. And in the US, a public university in Michigan adds a new major, East Asian Platform Governance. No one moment marks the shift, but the accumulation is clear. It's a world where China didn't just rise. It arrived earlier, more prepared, more integrated, and while it didn't replace the West, it stopped being an alternative. It became part of the center. And from there, history flows differently.